It begins softly, the way certain nights begin without needing permission, slipping into the air with a hush that feels both familiar and secret. On the table sat a box, unremarkable in its shape, yet quietly insistent in the way it seemed to draw every gaze toward it. The box did not move nor breathe, yet within it there was something alive, voices waiting, laughter folded tight, promises no one had quite asked for. It was a lullaby in disguise, a riddle pressed into wood and plastic, humming gently beneath the surface of a family already frayed at its edges. Rick leaned back, with that practiced calm of someone who had seen everything twice over and lost interest by the third time. Morty, though, felt the tremor beneath the stillness. His eyes darted, not away but into the shadows cast by the lamp, as if the box itself might open without touch and flood the room with more than anyone could handle. The Meeseeks echo still hung in the air, cheerful and trembling at once, when Morty's eyes drifted down, as though the floor could steady him better than the gaze of anyone else. He had always carried this tenderness, a way of shrinking inward when the world pressed too loudly against him. Even in childhood, before Rick's experiments and endless corridors of strangeness, Morty had been the boy who lingered on the edges of playgrounds, who bent his head to listen more than to speak, who noticed when someone's shoelace was undone, or when a friend's voice cracked under the weight of a hidden sadness. He did not have the sharp edges Rick sharpened into every sentence, nor the careless brilliance that dismissed consequence. Morty's gift was softer, quieter, the ache of wanting to matter, to not slip unseen into the blur of day. Rick glanced at him now, a quick measure that turned into a smirk, as though those very traits, the hesitations, the awkward honesty in Morty's eyes, were nothing more than obstacles to survival. Weakness, Rick might have said, though not aloud this time. He didn't need to. The flick of his eyebrow, the slight shrug of his shoulders, told Morty enough. But beneath that dismissal, there was something else Rick himself might not admit. He relied on Morty's softness, even if only in ways too subtle to name, because in Morty's gaze, the harsh edges of reality softened, if only briefly. Morty shifted uncomfortably, his hands pulling at the fabric of his shirt. He thought of small things, nights when he'd held on to dreams longer than he should have, mornings when he'd whispered questions into the pillow, hoping someone, anyone, would hear. He had always been honest in a clumsy way, blurting feelings before they were ready, stumbling into truths that left him red-faced and shaking. It was not bravery, not in the way Rick defined it, but it was a kind of rawness that refused to be hidden, a quiet insistence on being known before being forgotten. The Meeseeks stared at him expectantly, waiting for instruction, its wide smile unblinking. Morty hesitated. He could not ask for something grand, something outrageous. His heart wasn't wired for greed. What he wanted most was simpler, to not vanish into the noise, to be seen by the people who brushed past him day after day. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the words swelling and faltering, like waves too timid to break against shore. Rick chuckled under his breath, taking another swig from his flask, as if to punctuate the absurdity of it all. Come on, Morty, don't overthink it. They're made to serve a purpose. Ask, demand. That's all there is. His words were sharp, yet beneath them a faint curiosity lingered, the way someone watches a child stumble, yet wonders if they'll find a rhythm. Morty's silence stretched longer than expected, and even Rick tilted his head, as though maybe, just maybe, there was more to the boy's hesitance than weakness. Morty's quirks, his awkward honesty, his tenderness, his fear of being erased, were not flaws but seeds. Small seeds pressing against the dark, waiting for the right kind of soil, the right kind of light. In that moment, under the hum of artificial life, something unseen shifted. Rick might never admit it, but he noticed. And Morty, though unsure of himself, held within him the quiet beginnings of growth that even the loudest chaos could not erase. The room breathed with them, Rick's cynicism, Morty's tremors, the Meeseeks' hollow cheer, and together they formed a silence fuller than sound. Rick's voice broke the hush, careless yet deliberate. The way someone lights a match in the dark just to see if others flinch. "Go on, Morty. It's just a tool." Nothing more, but Morty didn't quite believe him. Tools could be simple, straightforward, but this felt like a doorway. He remembered nights as a child when he believed cupboards held kingdoms, when the hum of the fridge sounded like breathing. That same feeling settled now. The suspicion that reality had folds, and someone, maybe Rick, knew how to slip between them. The box waited. The family's chatter swirled faintly. Jerry's muttering about small failures, Summer's sighs filling empty corners, Beth's silence pressing in like a heavy curtain. Yet even their voices bent around the presence of it, like wind around a stone. It was as though they all sensed, even if only faintly, that nothing in the house was quite the same, with this thing resting among them. Morty wanted to ask if it was safe, but his throat felt caught. Instead, he watched Rick's eyes, sharp, amused and tired all at once. They told him something words did not, that unease was the right response, that maybe being afraid meant he understood more than the others did. The moment stretched, a quiet note held too long. Then, with a flick of Rick's wrist, the box clicked. A sound simple and small, like a glass being set on a counter, yet it broke the air in two. A figure shimmered into being, impossibly cheerful, impossibly fragile, its voice bright as if rehearsed for eternity. "I'm Mr. Meeseeks. Look at me." It was laughter, but it was also longing, like a melody practiced until it wore itself thin. Morty startled, his shoulders tight, but he did not step back. Somewhere inside he felt the strangeness of it, how joy could arrive so suddenly, so insistently, that it almost hurt to hear. Rick smirked, as though expecting both the wonder and the unease. He lifted his flask with a soft clink, not to toast, but to underline the point. This was only the beginning. The figure's eyes shone wide, endlessly eager, yet Morty thought he glimpsed something behind them, a glimmer not meant to be noticed, like a candle struggling at the edge of wind. And there the narrator leans closer, voice soft as the dark around a flame. "You are safe here, truly safe. We love you, in ways deeper than words can quite explain. This story is not a warning, but a lullaby, one that cares for you as you drift further inward. Before we step deeper into the folds of this tale, tell us quietly, in your heart if nowhere else, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Now, rest your gaze, soften your breath, and let the story carry you." The box had opened, the room had shifted, and though no one yet knew it, something irreversible had begun beneath quiet skies. Morty's fingers lingered uncertainly over the smooth edges of the box as though it might burn him if pressed too quickly. The button gleamed faintly, catching the dim light, and though it was nothing more than metal and circuitry, it seemed to breathe in the silence of the room. Rick leaned back, flask in hand, his eyes narrowed with both boredom and calculation, and muttered, "Go on, Morty. It's not rocket science. Just push it. They'll do whatever you ask." With a nervous swallow, Morty pressed the button. A soft pop filled the space, like the sound of a bubble breaking at the surface of water, and then it was there, small, bright, impossibly eager, its wide grin stretched too far, its eyes unblinking pools of sky-colored glass. The Meeseeks with a cheerful lilt. "I'm Mr. Meeseeks. Look at me." The words bounced through the air, light as laughter, yet with something hollow beneath, like a song sung too often. Morty stepped back instinctively, unsure whether to laugh or apologize. The creature's presence was both comical and unsettling, its cheer too immediate, too insistent, as though joy had been hammered into shape rather than grown. Rick smirked, tapping his flask against his knee. "See? Harmless. Ask it to make you a sandwich or something. Don't overcomplicate it, Morty." So Morty, still fumbling between hesitation and curiosity, whispered, Could you make me a sandwich?" The Meeseeks clapped its long blue hands together, delighted as if given the grandest purpose, and sprang into motion. Bread, mustard, a slice of meat. It assembled them with frantic care, humming its catchphrase under its breath like a lullaby gone strange. In less than a minute, the sandwich was there on the counter, ordinary in every way, and yet Morty stared at it with the weight of something unreal pressing at his chest. "Task complete," the Meeseeks beamed, its voice wobbling with both triumph and release. It bowed dramatically, almost reverently, then shimmered faintly around the edges, as though its very being was tied to the fragility of the wish fulfilled. With a quiet sigh that sounded too much like relief, it blinked out of existence, leaving behind only the faint echo of its cheer. Morty's hand hovered over the sandwich, but he didn't eat. Instead, he thought of that voice, how it carried both delight and sorrow, as if every syllable knew it would vanish once its duty was done. Rick chuckled, unfazed, as though such magic was no more than a trick of the light. "See? No big deal. They live for purpose, Morty. Give 'em one, and they're happy. That's all there is to it." His words fell heavy, practical, dismissive, but Morty felt something else. He felt the sadness tucked inside that bright-eyed grin, the fragility beneath the cheer. The Meeseeks had been alive only for a moment, yet in that moment it had smiled, worked, and longed for release. It hadn't asked for more, it hadn't wanted more, and Morty, clutching the sandwich in both hands, realized how much weight could rest inside something that seemed so simple. The air felt softer after, like the room itself had exhaled. Rick muttered something under his breath, already reaching for another experiment, while Morty sat in the hush of it all, tasting not the sandwich, but the quiet truth that small wishes could carry heavier echoes than anyone expected. The sandwich sat half-eaten on the counter, forgotten, while the memory of the vanishing Meeseeks lingered in the air like a faint perfume that refused to leave. Morty couldn't shake the thought of that smile, too wide and too desperate, vanishing in a blink once its purpose was fulfilled. Yet Rick, as always, brushed it aside, already pacing toward his next experiment. The box remained in plain sight, its button gleaming with quiet temptation, as though inviting more hands, more wishes. It wasn't long before the others noticed. Summer's eyes narrowed at the strange contraption, curiosity twisting into skepticism. "So, it just does whatever you tell it?" she asked, her voice sharp but wattened with doubt, like she wanted to believe and didn't want to at the same time. Rick waved a hand dismissively, muttering something about simplicity, while Morty shifted uncomfortably, knowing what it meant to summon that cheerful face again. Jerry, however, reached for it with the eagerness of someone starving for validation. His hands trembled as he pressed the button, and when the pop filled the kitchen once more, his voice cracked with urgency. "Help me be better at golf." It was such a small, almost ridiculous wish, yet it carried a desperation that made the request heavy. The Meeseeks that appeared looked the same as the first, bright-eyed, gleeful, insistent. "I'm Mr. Meeseeks. Look at me." But beneath its cheer, Morty swore he heard a strain, like a violin string pulled too tight. The house shifted. Summer pressed the button next, testing its promise with casual demands, little things to see if it would bend. Another Meeseeks appeared, then another. Their voices filled the air like echoes, all laughing, chirping, harmonizing in a strange and unsettling chorus. Each one declared its existence with the same rehearsed joy, and each one scrambled toward its given purpose. Beth remained silent, her eyes fixed on the blue figures darting around the house, their movements quick and unnatural. She didn't reach for the box, didn't ask for anything, and in that silence Morty felt the loudest voice of all, the voice of someone who had long ago stopped asking, because asking rarely brought what she truly wanted. The house grew crowded, not with family, but with versions of need made flesh. Meeseeks multiplied like whispers that wouldn't be silenced, their energy frantic, their cheer relentless. What began as comedy began to turn uncanny, the once familiar home bending into something strange. Every room carried overlapping voices, Summer's exasperation, Jerry's frantic desperation, Beth's quiet absence, Rick's muttered indifference, and through it all the Meeseeks chirped and clattered, the sound of their unending optimism becoming oppressive, like laughter echoing in a room where no one was laughing. Morty sat at the edge of it, his chest heavy. He realized the house wasn't filling with joy or relief, but with ghosts. Bright, blue, restless ghosts born not of death, but of desire. Each figure was a fragment of longing, exaggerated and ephemeral, a reminder of how fragile wishes could be when spoken aloud. The home that had once been noisy with ordinary squabbles now felt haunted by something far more intimate, the sound of needs too sharp to ignore. Rick, of course, raised his flask with a chuckle, amused at the chaos. But Morty's gaze lingered on the multiplying faces, each one smiling too brightly, as though aware of the inevitable unraveling that came when wishes piled too high. The house that once brimmed with overlapping voices now carried a strange heaviness, like a silence woven between the noise. Jerry stood in the middle of it all, clutching his golf club as if it might anchor him against the tide of blue figures that surrounded him. His wish had seemed so small, so laughable at first, but it lingered unresolved, clinging to him like a shadow he could never step out of. The Meeseeks assigned to him no longer chirped with unshaken joy. Their smiles, once sharp and unbreakable, began to bend, trembling at the edges. Morty was the first to notice. He heard it in the way their voices faltered, like lullabies sung past the point of comfort, notes stretching too thin. "Mr. Meeseeks, look at me," one cried, but the brightness was dimmed as if a candle burned low. Another repeated the same phrase, yet its tone wavered, almost pleading. Morty's stomach tightened. He wanted to believe they were fine, that their cheer was endless, but in their eyes he caught flickers, tiny fractures of exhaustion and sorrow. Jerry, blind to it, kept demanding more. "No, no, not like that. Watch my stance, my swing, my grip." His words tangled into desperation, spilling over with the weight of someone who never truly believed he could improve. The Meeseeks scrambled, pulling him this way and that, their hands shaping, correcting, insisting. But the more they tried, the more impossible the task became, not because it couldn't be done, but because Jerry's doubt was heavier than any burden they could lift. Summer rolled her eyes and turned away, dismissing the strangeness as Jerry being Jerry, while Beth's silence deepened, her gaze fixed on the way the creatures strained against their nature. Rick smirked, bemused at the absurdity of it all, his indifference like armor against the unease settling in the room. But Morty couldn't look away. He felt something tender and painful stirring inside him, as though he could hear the hidden song beneath their words, the song of beings designed only to exist in purpose, and the sorrow of being trapped when purpose slipped out of reach. One of the Meeseeks pressed its hands together as if in prayer, its voice trembling. "We just want to help, that's all we are." The sentence ended with a broken laugh, high-pitched and almost fragile. Morty's chest ached because he realized they weren't just cheerful servants. They were fleeting lives, each one burning fast and desperate, yearning only for release. And the longer Jerry clung to his wish, the more that release stretched away from them, leaving them suspended in a state they were never meant to endure. Their smiles cracked wider, not out of joy but strain, their bright faces twitching with the effort of holding on. The once harmonious chorus had turned dissonant, voices overlapping with a fevered edge. Morty shifted closer to Rick, his words small, almost a whisper. "Rick, they don't look okay." But Rick only shrugged, muttering something about inevitability, as if unraveling cheer and breaking spirits were simply part of the experiment. The house pulsed with the weight of it. Jerry's endless need, the Meeseeks' desperate cheer, eroding into sorrow, and Morty's quiet realization that even joy could fracture when stretched too far. It was no longer just about golf, no longer just about a clumsy swing. It had become a mirror, reflecting the cost of asking too much from those who were never meant to carry so heavy a burden. The room carried the brittle weight of fractured cheer, voices overlapping, breaking where they should have been light. Morty's unease pressed against his chest, and when he turned to Rick, hoping for comfort, what he found instead was a man half-slouched in a chair, bottle dangling loosely in one hand. Rick tilted it toward his lips, the amber liquid catching the glow of the kitchen light, before he finally muttered, "Kid, this is what happens when people ask too much of the universe. Something always cracks." His tone was casual, even dismissive, yet beneath the sarcasm lay an undertone that felt almost like warning. Morty frowned, his eyes darting back to the Meeseeks, who strained and trembled beneath the weight of Jerry's stubbornness. "But Rick, they're supposed to help. That's what they do." Rick chuckled, a low sound that vibrated more like exhaustion than amusement. "Yeah, and a match is supposed to burn. Doesn't mean you stick around and watch it try to light the ocean on fire, Morty. Tools break when you push them past what they're meant for." His words, softened by slurred edges, carried a sharpness that settled into Morty's thoughts like a shard of glass. The boy's gaze lingered on the creatures, their eyes bright and sorrowful at once. "It's not fair. They didn't ask for this." Rick wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve, his eyes half-lidded, but strangely steady. "Fair? Morty, the universe doesn't give two shits about fair. Fair is just a bedtime story people tell themselves, so they can sleep through the night. These things, they were born to vanish. The second they're done, you stretch that out, you turn it into torture. Not for them, not really. For you. Watch." Morty flinched at the word because torture felt too sharp, too cruel, yet as he watched the Meeseeks twitch and chatter, their smiles thinning into cracks, he couldn't deny the truth in it. Rick leaned closer, his voice dipping into a quieter register, almost like he was confiding, though his eyes remained distant. "That's the lesson, Morty. Life's a series of quick trades. You ask, you take, you let go. Ask for too much, cling too long, and someone always breaks in the middle." Morty's heart ached, but he couldn't pull away from the strange rhythm of Rick's words. They sounded like science at first, clinical, logical, the way Rick always framed the world, yet buried inside the sarcasm and cynicism was something that felt older, like a lantern flickering against endless night, not to comfort, but to illuminate the hard shapes of reality. He swallowed, trying to find meaning in the spaces between Rick's mutterings. "So, you're saying we shouldn't want too much?" Rick scoffed, waving his bottle as if brushing the thought aside. "Want whatever you want, Morty. Just don't be surprised when the wanting eats you alive. That's not philosophy, it's math." His laugh came sharp, but Morty caught the weary tilt of his shoulders, the shadow in his eyes that betrayed how often Rick had lived through his own words. The Meeseeks cried again, voices cracking under the weight of an impossible wish. Morty turned back to them, feeling the echo of Rick's lesson vibrate deep in his chest. It wasn't just about Yuri's golf swing, it was about everything: the cost of asking, the fragility of what answered, and the inevitability of something breaking when you held on too tight. Rick leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, and in the hush between their words, Morty realized that sometimes wisdom arrived, dressed in sarcasm, carried by a drunk's laugh, hidden like a lantern too dim to banish darkness, but just bright enough to show the way forward. Night stretched heavy, filled with the strained voices of Meeseeks and the brittle tension of a family unraveling beneath their own desires. Rick's words still clung to Morty's ears, harsh yet lingering with a weight that wouldn't lift. He could feel the truth in them, but truth alone didn't soften the edges of suffering. Morty wasn't built like Rick, able to laugh off the ache of broken things. His chest tightened as he watched the Meeseeks falter, their cheer collapsing into fragments, their eyes holding a sadness too sharp for something that wasn't meant to last. For a moment, Morty wanted to look away. It would have been easier to pretend it wasn't his problem, to follow Rick's shrug and let the universe do what it always did, crack, break, forget. But then he saw one of the Meeseeks lower its head, its voice trembling as it promised, still to help. That flicker of loyalty, even as it fractured, struck something deep inside him. Morty stepped forward, not with a plan or some grand fix, but with the soft instinct of care that had always lived in him, quiet and uncertain. He knelt beside the creature, his hand hovering before settling lightly on its thin shoulder. The Meeseeks shivered beneath the touch, its wide eyes blinking, as though surprised. Morty's voice came out low, almost a whisper, shaky but tender. "It's okay, you tried, that's enough." The words weren't magic, but they carried a warmth the Meeseeks hadn't heard before. For just a second, its trembling eased, its smile steadied, fragile but real. Around the room, chaos continued. Jerry's insistence, Summer's frustrated sighs, Rick's muttered commentary, but Morty lingered in that small space of connection. He couldn't change what was unraveling, but he could soften the fall. Each time another Meeseek staggered under the impossible weight of its task, Morty met its gaze. A nod, a glance that said, "I see you." His presence became a thread of calm, woven into the disorder, quiet but holding. It wasn't strength the way Rick defined it, loud, sharp, unyielding. Morty's courage was smaller, the kind that didn't demand notice, the kind that worked in shadows and silences. He offered no solutions, only kindness, and in that simplicity lay something stronger than any fix. When Beth's silence pressed heavy, Morty touched her arm, his awkward smile faltering but genuine. She didn't answer, but her eyes softened, if only for a breath. Even Rick, half lost in his bottle, opened one eye to watch. He didn't comment, didn't tease, but in his gaze there was the faintest flicker of recognition. Morty's tenderness wasn't weakness, it was a shield, invisible but steady, against the sharp edges of a breaking world. The Meeseeks' voices still cracked, their smiles still wavered, and the house still echoed with desperation. But amidst it all, Morty's small acts gathered like stones in a river, redirecting the current just enough, not to stop it, not to fix it, but to let the weight pass with less ruin. And in that quiet, fragile balance, Morty discovered a kind of courage he hadn't known before, the kind that soothed rather than conquered, that healed not by changing the world, but by reminding it of its softer side. The air in the house grew heavy, like a blanket pressed too close, suffocating with its stillness. The Meeseeks, once bright and cheerful in their strange, lilting voices, now faltered, their words dragged like torn fabric, ragged and uneven, promises cracking under the weight of what could never be done. Morty watched as their shapes flickered at the edges, blue outlines fraying as though the world itself were forgetting how to hold them together. What had begun with laughter now trembled like a lullaby breaking mid-song. Jerry still clung to his demands, his voice sharp, desperate, a man begging not only for help, but for some proof of worth. Yet each insistence only deepened the fracture. The Meeseeks looked at him with pleading eyes that no longer shone with hope, but with exhaustion. Their bodies bent and twitched, too fragile for the task. Morty could hardly bear the sound of their voices, once playful, now trembling with sorrow, like children too tired to keep pretending. Rick leaned back, sighing through his teeth, muttering something that danced between cynicism and resignation. To him, the collapse was inevitable, a lesson painted in bright blue. But to Morty, it felt like standing at the edge of a dream that was tearing itself apart, where the rules that once held everything steady now dissolved in silence. He reached instinctively for Rick's sleeve, fingers curling in the rough fabric of his coat. It wasn't that Rick had all the answers, Morty knew he didn't. But in that moment, he needed something solid, something to hold against the unraveling. Rick didn't push him away. He simply let Morty cling, his eyes half-lidded, his expression unreadable, as though he too felt the pull of something fragile beneath the chaos. Morty's chest rose and fell, each breath shallow, awe and fear mingling in equal measure. He couldn't look away from the Meeseeks creatures caught between loyalty and despair, between being and dissolving. They had been summoned with a promise of simplicity, yet now their very existence trembled under the weight of an impossible request. The room itself seemed to waver, voices overlapping with broken laughter, shadows bending at strange angles. Every second stretched, every sound too sharp, like glass ready to shatter. Morty's thoughts blurred, caught between pity for the Meeseeks and terror at what would happen when they disappeared entirely. He wondered if their fading would leave behind silence, or if some echo of their sorrow would linger, whispering long after the light was gone. Rick's arm shifted slightly, a subtle reminder of presence, and Morty drew in a steadier breath. The world was breaking at its edges, but he was not alone. The mists staggered, the shapes dimming, their cries rough and urgent, as if they too understood that their time was nearly done. Morty squeezed Rick's sleeve tighter, grounding himself, though the awe in his chest never left. The awe of watching something unnatural fold into silence, fragile and terrible all at once. And in that fragile balance he felt the truth of it settle like dust in the air. Some wishes were never meant to be fulfilled, and some creations could not hold their shape against the weight of wanting too much. When the last of the flickering blue light dimmed, silence draped itself across the house like a heavy curtain. The Meeseeks were gone, their voices leaving no echo, no trace but the fragile tension that still trembled in the air. The family sat scattered, breathing unevenly as though the chaos had stolen the rhythm from their chests. Jerry leaned against the wall, his shoulders slumped inward, the bravado drained from him until he seemed almost smaller than the space he occupied. His eyes wandered, restless but lost, searching for something that would not arrive. Summer shifted uneasily, her fingers fidgeting with a loose thread at the seam of the couch. She wanted to say something. Morty could feel it in the way she moved, but the words tangled before they reached her lips. Restlessness wrapped around her like an invisible chain, her doubts filling the silence even without sound. Beth sat apart, her arms folded in quiet ache. She didn't cry, not even close, but the stillness of her body held an emptiness as though she carried both pride and sorrow inside her without knowing which weighed more. Morty watched them with new eyes, his chest rising and falling slowly, as though trying to match the broken rhythm of the room. He had always known his family through noise, arguments, teasing, sarcastic remarks that left sharp edges behind. But in this quiet, stripped of the layers, he saw something softer. He saw Jerry's desperation, not as weakness, but as a plea for worth. He saw Summer's unease, not as irritation, but as a quiet fight, to be seen. And Beth, with her silence, carried a love she didn't always know how to show, but Morty could feel it there, buried under her stillness like a heartbeat under stone. Rick poured himself another drink, muttering under his breath, but Morty barely heard him. His focus was caught by the small gestures. The glance Summer gave Beth when she thought no one noticed. The way Jerry's hand twitched as though he wanted to reach out but didn't. The faint sigh Beth let out as if the weight of everything pressed too deep on her chest. They weren't perfect, none of them. But in their brokenness Morty found a strange comfort. Love didn't vanish just because it was buried under flaws. The air settled little by little, breaths falling back into rhythm. No one had answers, no one had solved anything, but Morty realized they didn't need to. Not right now. Sometimes surviving the storm meant sitting in its quiet shadow, letting the silence remind them of what was left. He let his gaze linger on each of them, holding them in that quiet moment, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't see strangers bound by frustration. He saw a family fractured and stumbling, but still tied together by threads that refused to break. And in that fragile reflection, Morty understood something unspoken, that love often hid behind exhaustion, that care lived quietly in glances and sighs, and that even in the silence after chaos there was something worth holding on to. The house remained quiet long after the last words had dissolved into the air. The family drifted into their own corners, not quite at peace, but too tired to fight the silence. Morty lingered, his body heavy with the weight of everything that had happened, his eyes drawn toward Rick, who stood apart, glass in hand, the faint sound of liquid swirling marking the only rhythm left in the room. Rick's face was lined in shadows, his usual sneer dulled into something softer, almost human. Morty moved closer, not with purpose but with a quiet need that even he couldn't name. Rick glanced down, gave the faintest grunt, then wordlessly held out the glass. Morty hesitated, then took a sip, the bitter burn surprising him, grounding him in a way he didn't expect. Rick smirked faintly, not mocking, not cruel, just the kind of smirk that said, "Yeah, kid, life tastes like that." It was nothing grand, no sweeping gesture, but in that shared drink, Morty felt something pass between them, something unspoken and solid. Rick slouched into the couch and Morty followed, their shoulders brushing lightly. Neither moved away. There was no need for words, no dramatic explanation, just the quiet rhythm of two people who had been through too much together and had somehow, impossibly, endured. Rick muttered under his breath about faulty wishes and broken machines, about how people always wanted too much and ended up with nothing. Morty listened, not for the logic, but for the warmth buried beneath the sarcasm, a lantern's flicker hidden in Rick's rough voice. The boy leaned against his grandfather, not quite resting, but letting the closeness settle. Rick didn't pull away. He let Morty's weight rest against him, and in that simple allowance, there was care dearer than any words could give. Survivors didn't always need explanations. They didn't need to fix the past or rewrite the mistakes. Sometimes they only needed to sit together in the quiet aftermath, to feel the faint glow of connection in the dimmest corners. Outside, the night pressed its silence against the walls, and inside, the faint clink of Rick's glass and Morty's slow breathing filled the space. A lantern in shadows, flickering but steady, enough to remind them both that even after everything, they were not entirely alone. The morning light crept through the blinds, thin and pale, as though even the sun approached with caution. The house, once echoing with clashing voices and frantic commands, now felt hollow, emptied of its strange pets. The Meeseeks were gone, dissolving into nothingness like dreams that slipped away upon waking. No grand farewell, no spectacle, just absence, leaving behind only the faint memory of their fragile smiles and trembling laughter. Morty sat quietly, his gaze unfixed, as though searching the air for some trace of them. For a moment he questioned if they had ever been real at all, or if their bright voices had simply been echoes in his imagination. Yet the silence they left behind was too heavy to be make-believe. The world felt altered, not broken, but marked, like a page where the ink had sunk too deep. Rick the night stretched wide and quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to lean closer the longer one listened. Morty tilted his head back, his eyes tracing constellations he couldn't name, their distant glow steady against the shifting weight of his thoughts. The stars looked down like watchful eyes, not judging, not comforting, simply existing, eternal witnesses to his small, trembling world. He breathed slowly, feeling the cool air press against his skin, as though the universe itself were reminding him to pause, to remember. Beside him, Rick slouched against the hood of the ship, a bottle dangling loosely in one hand. He wasn't lecturing, wasn't mocking, just humming under his breath. The tune was broken, uneven, almost lost in the rustle of the night breeze, but there was something tender in it, an old song perhaps, dragged from a corner of memory. Even Rick didn't care to examine. Morty didn't ask, he just listened, because in that quiet hum was something softer than words, something that felt like care in disguise. Morty's mind drifted back to the flickering smiles of the Meeseeks, to their fragile cheer dissolving in silence. What was lost felt heavy still, but it no longer crushed him. It simply rested like a stone he had learned to carry. What was gained was harder to name, a kind of knowing, a sense that even broken moments could leave behind a strange light. He glanced at Rick, at the man who wrapped truth in sarcasm and hid sorrow in laughter, and he felt it again, that bond, unspoken yet real, a fragile thread glowing faintly beneath the night sky. "Come," muttered something dismissive, calling it cleanup, calling it inevitable, but Morty heard more than the words. He had seen the strain in the Meeseeks' eyes, had felt the weight of their fading cheer. They had lived only to serve, and when the requests became too heavy, they cracked beneath them. Wishes, Morty realized, carried weight, not just for the one who asked, but for the one who bore it. He thought of Jerry's desperation, of Summer's doubts, of Beth's silence, of his own quiet longing not to be forgotten. Each demand had been small, yet each had cost more than they had imagined. The Meeseeks' vanishing was not victory, but a quiet toll. Morty's heart ached, not with regret, but with something softer, a tenderness for lives that flickered briefly, then vanished without blame. As Rick poured another drink and shrugged at the world's absurdity, Morty held on to that feeling. He understood now that kindness, though smaller than any wish, was lighter, easier to carry, less likely to break the fragile threads that bound everything together. The Meeseeks were gone, but their lesson lingered, delicate as dawn, that not every desire should be spoken, and not every silence was empty. The night stretched wide and quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to lean closer the longer one listened. Morty tilted his head back, his eyes tracing constellations he couldn't name, their distant glow steady sestince the shifting weight of his thoughts. The stars looked down like watchful eyes, not judging, not comforting, simply existing, eternal witnesses to his small, trembling world. He breathed slowly, feeling the cool air press against his skin, as though the universe itself were reminding him to pause, to remember. Beside him, Rick slouched against the hood of the ship, a bottle dangling loosely in one hand. He wasn't lecturing, wasn't mocking, just humming under his breath. The tune was broken, uneven, almost lost in the rustle of the night breeze, but there was something tender in it, an old song perhaps, dragged from a corner of memory even Rick didn't care to examine. Morty didn't ask, he just listened, because in that quiet hum was something softer than words, something that felt like care in disguise. Morty's mind drifted back to the flickering smiles of the Meeseeks, to their fragile cheer dissolving in silence. What was lost felt heavy still, but it no longer crushed him. It simply rested like a stone he had learned to carry. What was gained was harder to name, a kind of knowing, a sense that even broken moments could leave behind a strange light. He glanced at Rick, at the man who wrapped truth in sarcasm and hid sorrow in laughter, and he felt it again, that bond, unspoken yet real, a fragile thread glowing faintly beneath the night sky. The night held its silence, but it was no longer empty. It seemed filled with echoes, faint traces of voices that had already faded, and yet lingered as if stitched into the air itself. The story did not end there, and perhaps it never truly could. Stories do not finish in thunder or applause. They settle, like dust on a shelf, like a hum carried through quiet rooms. The house stood just as it always had, its walls worn but unbroken, its corners still holding the warmth of laughter and arguments alike, flawed, restless, aching, and yet alive, carrying its own stubborn pulse of love. Morty let his eyes drift shut, not to escape, but to rest within the knowledge that love had always been there, hiding in plain sight, even when it looked like silence. Summer's sighs, Jerry's fumbling, Beth's searching, each a thread frayed but real, weaving something that refused to fall apart completely. Rick's hum lingered faintly in his ears, a lullaby disguised as carelessness, and beneath it all, Morty found a rhythm, steady enough to trust, gentle enough to dream with. The narrator leans closer, not to explain but to remind. Every wish leaves a trace. Every moment bends into memory. Kindness carries farther than demand, and love, quiet, imperfect love, remains the farthest gravity of all. Morty breathed deeper, shoulders loosening, and the night folded around him like a blanket. He did not need answers now. He only needed rest, and as he slipped between thought and dream, the story drifted with him, softer with each breath, until it felt less like words and more like sleep itself.